The forbidden encounter. Night fell over Jerusalem. A gentle breeze blew across the palace rooftops as King David walked alone. His gaze wandered across the moonlit city until something made him stop. There in the distance, a woman was bathing under the stars. Her name was Bate-Sheba. Her hair fell over her shoulders and the water reflected the nightlight on her skin. She didn't know she was being watched, but David, the warrior king, the man after God's own heart, was now just a man overcome by an irresistible desire. He didn't look away. He couldn't resist the temptation. "Who is that woman?" he asked his servants. The answer came quickly, but laden with a silent warning. Bate-Sheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite, a married woman, a faithful wife to one of the king's most loyal warriors. But none of this was enough to stop David. The order was given, "Bring her to me." A king's invitation was not refused. When Bate-Sheba entered the royal chambers, their destinies were already sealed. What began as a forbidden glance turned into a consuming passion, a sin that would resonate for generations. That night, Israel was not ruled by a wise and just king, but by a man given over to his impulses. What David didn't know was that this single decision would change not only his life, but the history of the entire people of Israel. And the price for that encounter would be high, very high. King David had it all: power, riches, victories. But he wanted more. And that desire led him to betray one of the most loyal men in his army. Bate-Sheba now carried in her womb the forbidden fruit of her night with the king. The news fell upon David like thunder. The sin he was trying to hide grew within her. There was a problem. Bate-Sheba was the wife of Uriah, a faithful warrior, a man of honor. David called Uriah back from the war. He tried to force him to return home so that the child could be taken as his own. But Uriah was different. He slept on the palace floor, refusing to enjoy comfort while his comrades were on the battlefield. David's plan had failed. Uriah didn't fall for it. He was too loyal, too honest. He refused to return home and sleep with his wife while his comrades fought. The king realized there was only one way out: eliminate him. David took a scroll, wrote a cold and ruthless order, sealed it, and gave it to Uriah himself to deliver to the commander Joab. The loyal soldier, unknowingly, carried his own sentence within him. The order was clear: put Uriah in the front line, in the most dangerous place of the battle, and fall back. Leave him alone. The plan was executed. The war continued, swords clashed, shouts echoed, and Uriah fell. The news reached the palace. David sighed with relief. Now he could take Bate-Sheba as his wife and hide his sin, but God's eyes were upon him. The palace fell silent as the prophet Nathan entered. His eyes carried the weight of a divine message, and before him stood King David, the man after God's own heart, but also a man stained by sin. Nathan approached and told him a story. There were two men in a city. One was rich and owned many flocks. The other was poor and had only one sheep, which she loved like a daughter. One day, a traveler came to the rich man's house. But instead of taking one of his own sheep to feed the visitor, he took the poor man's only sheep and slaughtered it. David was furious. He rose from the throne with fury in his eyes. "This man deserves to die. He will pay 4 times as much for this injustice." The silence became unbearable. Then Nathan pointed to the king and said, "That man is you." The truth fell upon David like a fatal blow. He had taken Uriah's wife just as the rich man stole the poor man's sheep. And what's worse, he made Uriah pay with his own life. "The sword will never depart from your house," Nathan said. "Evil will arise from within your own family. Your sin will be exposed before all." David felt the weight of divine judgment. His throne was stained. Your house was condemned to suffer the consequences of your... He fell to his knees, crying out for mercy. But the price of sin always comes, and the bitter harvest was just beginning. The palace fell silent. Bate-Sheba's muffled screams echoed through the halls. In her arms, she held the fragile body of her son, the fruit of a forbidden passion, now fighting for his very life. The child was burning with fever. His tiny chest rose and fell with difficulty. Outside, David fasted and cried out to God, his soul consumed by despair. But the sentence had already been decreed. The prophet Nathan had spoken. The king's sin would not go unpunished, and now the innocent life of her son was at stake. Bate-Sheba could not accept it. She had already lost a husband. Would she now lose a son? Her eyes were red from crying. Her fragile hands caressed the baby's warm skin, trying to hold him between life and death. But time was cruel. On the seventh day, breathing ceased. The mother's lament swept through the palace like an invisible sword. The king remained silent when he received the news. He simply stood up, washed his face, and entered the temple to worship God. "Why?" the servants asked. And David answered in a broken voice, "While I was alive, I fasted and wept, for who knows if the Lord will have mercy. But now that he is dead, what's the point of fasting? Can I bring him back? One day I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Grief still hung over the palace. Bate-Sheba's mourning was silent and deep. She had lost a husband. She had lost a son. She had lost peace. Her heart carried the weight of the past, and her eyes, once full of life, now reflected only sadness. But God didn't finish his story. David, seeing her consumed by grief, tried to comfort her. From a love marked by suffering, a new promise was born, and so Bate-Sheba became pregnant again. This time, a new child was born. His name, Solomon. The boy grew strong, loved by his parents, but there was something else. God had chosen that child for a great destiny. The Lord sent the prophet Nathan to announce something unexpected. The Lord loves this child. Nathan named the boy Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. That name was more than a title. It was a divine seal, a reminder that God is capable of transforming pain into purpose. Years later, Solomon would not only inherit David's throne, but would become the wisest and most prosperous king in Israel's history. The woman who once wept over irreparable losses now saw her son crowned by God's will. Bate-Sheba lived to see that even in the midst of sin and tragedy, God's grace still writes new stories. King David was aging. His body no longer had the strength it had had in war, and Israel's throne would soon need a successor. But in the palace, conspiracies swirled in the halls. Adonijah, one of King David's oldest sons, believed the kingdom was rightfully his. Without waiting for David's decision, he crowned himself king. The people began to follow him, and soon his name was echoing as the next ruler. But there was a problem. God had chosen Solomon. Bate-Sheba knew the future of the kingdom, and her son were threatened. She could not remain silent. Determined, she entered the king's presence. David, who was in his final days, heard her urgent words. "My lord, did you not promise that Solomon would reign after you?" Shortly after, the prophet Nathan entered, confirming Adonijah's betrayal. David could not allow his promise to be broken. And then, before the people, the king gave the order. "Solomon shall be king in my place." Adonijah's coup was crushed. Solomon was crowned, and Bate-Sheba became the queen mother, the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Now her son sat on the throne of Israel, and her position ensured that the lineage promised by God would continue. Behind the scenes of history, Bate-Sheba was not just a spectator. She was instrumental in the fulfillment of God's plan. Time passed, and now Solomon ruled Israel with wisdom and power. Bate-Sheba was no longer just the king's wife, but the queen mother, the most influential woman in the kingdom. Her son ruled justly, but not everyone was happy about it. Adonijah, who had previously tried to seize the throne, now approached with a new plan. He no longer claimed the crown, at least not directly. This time his strategy was subtle, almost innocent. He sought out Bate-Sheba and made a seemingly simple request. Ask King Solomon to grant me Abishag, the young woman who cared for David in his final days, as a wife. Bate-Sheba hesitated. The request seemed harmless, but there was something hidden. In royal tradition, taking a woman who had belonged to the previous king was a way to reclaim the throne. Still, she decided to intercede. After all, it was her last appearance in history, and her role was not over. She entered King Solomon's chamber. As soon as she entered the royal chamber, something remarkable happened. Solomon stood up and ordered a throne to be brought for his mother. He honored her before everyone. Then she made her request to Adonijah. Solomon's countenance changed. He realized his brother's true intention and, without hesitation, decreed, Adonijah will pay with his life. Thus, with a single decision, the young king eliminated his last threat, and Bate-Sheba, her role in history was complete. As mother, wife, and queen, she watched her son consolidate the throne she herself helped secure. Bate-Sheba's story began marked by scandal. Taken by King David on a forbidden night, she lost a husband, a son, and saw her life plunge into sorrow. Her name was long associated with sin and betrayal, but God did not abandon her. He turned her tragedy into purpose. From Bate-Sheba's womb was born Solomon, the wisest king Israel had ever known. And more than that, from her lineage came the Messiah himself, Jesus Christ. This changes everything. Bate-Sheba was not defined by her past, but by God's sovereign plan. She went from being a woman embroiled in scandal to becoming the Queen Mother of Israel, a figure of influence and respect. Her name, which could have been forgotten in shame, was remembered in glory. She is in Christ's genealogy, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, a living symbol of redemption. And what does her story teach us? That sin has consequences, but God's grace is greater. That pain can be a path to transformation. That God doesn't choose perfect people, but people he can restore. Bate-Sheba's legacy demonstrates that no failure is too great to thwart divine purpose. For when God writes history, even pages stained by error can be used to reveal his glory.